Do you like scary travel stories? From haunted hotels to unexplained sounds and creepy sights, the true travel stories I'll tell you now all have one thing in common. They'll give you goosebumps and make you want to keep a night light with you next time you travel. In the meantime, go grab a snack and a drink and settle in to hear some truly chilling travel stories. 1. Scary travel stories from a haunted cabin. When it comes to creepy road trip stories and travel horror stories, this is by far my most terrifying. When I was growing up, my family owned a cabin in Hancock, New York, in the Catskills. It was mainly used for hunting, but we'd also drive up there to hike, ride quads, make campfire s'mores, and just be in nature. This cabin was small. It was actually a trailer that was affixed into the ground and then added onto slightly. Because of this, my cousin and I would share a big bed in the main part of the trailer and my dad would sleep on the couch, but we were all virtually in the same room. One night when I was about 10, I woke up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night and saw a man standing at the end of the bed staring at me. I knew instantly he was a ghost, as he was translucent and was dressed like he was from the mid-1800s. Quickly, I threw the cover over my head and squeezed next to my cousin, terrified. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew I was on the floor of the trailer, next to the couch. I could hear my dad snoring loudly, but every time I tried to reach out to wake him up, something would grab my hand and pull it back. The next morning, I woke up on the floor of the trailer with my hands over my head. I woke up in an even weirder position the following night, when my cousin and I awoke with the bed covered in vomit. It was from me, but I had no recollection of throwing up, and I'd never thrown up in my sleep before. But, wait, didn't you say in the title that there were multiple scary travel stories? Yes, and that's where things get even more creepy. The next 2 times that I went to the cabin, I ended up waking up covered in my own vomit, with barely any recollection of throwing up. This is something that had never happened to me before, but yet it was happening constantly at the cabin. Eventually we sold the cabin, though years later I was told that a family member once claimed to see a UFO landing in the yard when he got up to use the toilet at 3 a.m. Even now, over 20 years after the incident, I still remember it vividly, and I firmly believe that that cabin is possessed by something inhuman. Many people imagine injuries and lost passports when thinking about travel horror stories, but for me, it's definitely this. 2. The Edinburgh Vaults, tall tales for tourists, or something sinister. The air that hung around me was cool but by no means fresh. It clung to me in the dark, thick with stories, none of which ended happily, I was told. A friend and I were taking a ghost tour of Edinburgh's underground vaults below South Bridge. These ancient rooms had been used by tradesmen for storage, but all manner of creepy stories surround them. Some say serial killers used them to hide bodies, others say plague victims were left here to meet their bitter end. Much of the tour was designed for tourists, including a member of staff jumping out to scare us. Our guide also told us that many guests have odd experiences in the days following the tour. He told us that car radios start out of the blue, and household items mysteriously move around. I passed this off as just another tall tale for tourists, although not for long. My friend and I returned to her apartment and went to bed. Something must have disturbed me because I found myself awake in the middle of the night. I was groggy, but something wasn't right. The door was moving. It swung from fully open to closed, creaking as it did so. I was no longer groggy. There was a reasonable explanation, I knew, if I could just think of it fast enough. Ah, yes. My friend had probably gone to the bathroom and pulled the door closed behind her. I mustered up the courage to roll over, praying to see an empty side to the bed. No. She was fast asleep beside me. Damn it. I lay there shivering, aware there was no explanation for what I just experienced. The next morning, I felt unsettled and flicked through my photos from the tour. I stopped on one that I had taken in almost complete darkness down in the vaults. Two bright neon lights, scratches like fingernails, ran across the screen, despite the fact that there had been no lights in the room where it was taken. I decided to email it to the tour company to see what they would say. The cheery manager replied, they saw many unexplained photos like this, and did I mind if they kept it for their database? I didn't mind, I told him. But secretly, my mind was running into overdrive. What on earth had I witnessed in Edinburgh? 3. An evil presence in a hotel. Love scary hotel stories. Many years ago, I stayed at the Stoneleigh Hotel while attending a convention in Dallas. It has a penthouse suite that has hosted Elvis Presley, John Lennon, and many other famous guests. At the time I stayed there, the penthouse stood empty because it was undergoing renovations. Late one night, I befriended a security guard who invited me, along with one of my co-workers, to tour the penthouse. We immediately took him up on the offer. He explained that one of the rooms contained a hidden door that led to an elevator. Apparently one of the previous owners had installed it so he could easily access a room on a different floor where his mistresses stayed. The guard informed us that one of the ladies had fallen to her death in that elevator shaft. He said employees could sometimes still hear the creaking sounds of the elevator, even though it was no longer in use. My friend and I separated as we meandered through all of the rooms on the penthouse level. Even under its state of construction, the beauty of the space was clearly evident. We both had cameras with us, and took lots of photos. At one point I wandered down a narrow hallway that appeared to be a servant's prep area of some sort, which led to the kitchen. The lights weren't functioning at the time, and it was after midnight, so it was difficult to make out all of the details. Once I was a few steps into the space, I immediately felt cold and my instincts told me to turn around, so I did. I continued exploring the rest of the space and eventually met up with my friend on one of the balconies. We chatted with the security guard for a few moments, thanked him, and then left. It wasn't until the next day when we were driving home from the convention that we started discussing the details of the penthouse. I asked if she'd noticed the dark hallway that led to the kitchen, and she said yes. I told her I'd started to walk down the hallway but stopped myself because it felt cold and creepy, even evil. She was nodding her head in agreement and started excitedly telling me how she'd started walking into the same space and had been overcome with a feeling of pure evil. She described it as a very tangible, physical sensation, and said she immediately turned around and left the space. We were both fascinated that we'd felt almost the exact same feelings, in the exact same area, yet neither of us mentioned it to the other until almost a full day later. It's still one of the craziest experiences I've had in a hotel. Interestingly, I found out that the hotel is known to be haunted when I did some digging on Google. Apparently, I'm not the only one who has had a creepy experience here. 4. Camping at an abandoned restaurant in the Dominican Republic. Every now and then we love heading out on a hiking and camping trip to the beautiful Dominican mountains to enjoy the pristine tropical nature and to escape from daily life. This time we headed from Punta Cana to Loma Linda, a mountain with a gorgeous panorama view, and an abandoned restaurant. When pitching our tent, we put it on the old restaurant structures to protect us from the rain. When going to sleep, we left our tent door half open to benefit from some additional ventilation. During the night, we heard many strange sounds as if someone was stepping on the rickety timber planks outside. Of course, there was no one, except a big frog with disproportional big red eyes, looking in the direction of our tent. To complete the spooky atmosphere, an old light bulb outside of the restaurant was randomly turning on and off, even though there was actually no electricity. To feel a bit safer and to protect us from the strong winds, I asked my girlfriend if we should close our tent door. She said yes, and just seconds later, the tent door was blown up by the wind and literally closed itself. We had a fitful sleep out there, to say the least. The next morning, when we were packing up our stuff, an old man came up the mountain on his horse and asked if we had a good night. Sure, except for those noises, animals, steps and the creepy wind, everything was fine. At least the view from Loma Linda was worth it. So if you'd like to explore this beautiful place during your holiday in the Dominican Republic, maybe you should come during the day. 5. Pursued by malevolent spirits in Chiapas, Mexico. After spending an afternoon exploring a cemetery in San Cristobal de las Casas, Mexico, I woke up in the middle of the night in the throes of a terrible nightmare. In my dream I was strapped to the spokes of a burning wheel as it rolled down a field of dry corn stalks. Just as my hair burst into flames, I sat up and saw my clock flashing 666. After washing my face in the washroom I looked in the mirror and saw black wings fluttering behind my head almost like bats. I felt a presence in the room, yet when I turned around nothing was there. I stayed awake all night unable to sleep. At daylight, I left the hotel to get a coffee. If this wasn't one of the craziest travel stories you ever heard yet, as soon as I stepped onto the street a black bird fell dead from the sky at my feet. Then a man was hit by a car directly in front of me. And then the young stray dog I'd been feeding for close to a month was lying dead by the side of the church. I felt as though I was a veritable walking plague of bad luck. Not knowing what to do, I continued with my plan to visit the Museo de la Medicina Maya. It's dedicated to the preservation of natural medicine, therapeutic treatments, and traditional practices of the Tzotzil and Totol peoples of Chiapas. In addition to the herbal garden and displays, there was a community space where it was possible to have a consultation with a local shaman. With the assistance of a translator, I was told I had committed a transgression and was being pursued by malevolent spirits or energies attempting to attach themselves to me. He wrote out a prescription for the materials for a spiritual cleansing and I got it filled by a woman tending one of the stalls in the market. I returned to the Mayan center with a variety of products including eggs, basil, and fragrant herbs in a basket. After a rigorous process that involved chanting, copal, smoke, and herbs, he declared I was cleansed of the spirits. He suggested that in the future I protect myself spiritually before wandering around in areas where lost spirits or negative energies may be residing or searching, such as cemeteries. I left the clinic very grateful to be free of the negative energies, and to have learned a lesson. I now try to remember not to frequent potentially dark places unless I protect myself according to the shaman's instructions. 6. A dream within a dream. I'd just arrived at a tiny hostel a short journey from Huaraz, after a few days of hiking and camping in the mountains of Peru. It was the only accommodation for miles, was completely empty, and the place was run by a very old but welcoming Peruvian couple. The owners happily greeted us but also seemed surprised that we'd found them. Later in the evening, I was chatting with one of the owners while cooking some dinner. My Spanish wasn't great but I recall him saying the words miedo and fantasma, which I knew meant fear and ghost. Unfortunately, I couldn't understand enough to know exactly what he was saying and didn't think much of it. After days of heavy hiking and a bit of altitude sickness, I crashed early, looking forward to the first night in a bed for a while. That's when this officially turned into a scary trip story. I conked out immediately but then became slightly conscious after hearing noises from outside the room. I remember having a very uneasy feeling and it being cold. I kept on looking up towards the door and noticed it was slightly ajar. Slowly, I saw a small figure-like shape sitting by the top of the door with an ominous face looking down on me. I felt rigid, just staring at this figure above the door. By this point, I was feeling truly scared. All of a sudden I shot up in my bed, dripping with sweat, and realized that it was just a dream. I felt a strange feeling of half-awake relief and then looked back up towards the door to see this dark figure was still perched up there looking at me. The feeling of panic that followed was indescribable. I completely froze in terror for what seemed like ages, just staring at this figure. I then woke up, again, just like I had, but with much more sensation and a gasp of breath. The first time waking up was part of the dream. I'd never experienced anything similar before, or again after that night. I spent the rest of the night too damn terrified to fall asleep and trying my hardest not to look at the door. The next morning I spoke to the other owner, who spoke clearer English and told me that people had said the room was haunted by a ghost. I struggled to sleep in hostels for a long time afterwards.